They don't write songs about the kind of evil that hides behind money and power. Not out here, not under this sun. Out here, evil is silent, quiet like a coffin. And when something bad happens, it doesn't scream. It just arrives, uninvited, and waits for someone fool enough to open the door. That morning, Caleb Thorne opened the door. It was a dry, heavy dawn in Tombstone, Arizona. Caleb stepped outside, coffee in hand, old wood creaking under his boots. The land stretched quiet in every direction, not a single wind blowing. He'd come out to check on the livestock, but what caught his eye wasn't a stray cow. It was a wagon, small, old, left near the fence line. No driver, no tracks, just dust and heat. A mule stood tied to the post, chewing at nothing like it had been waiting too long. And in the back of that wagon, under a torn canvas, was something, or someone. There was a note tucked into the knot of rope. 4 words. Paid in full. Property delivered. Caleb narrowed his eyes. He hadn't ordered anything, and even if he had, no man sends property without a name or a knock. He stepped closer. The smell hit first. Sweat, blood, old fear. He pulled the canvas back slowly. There she was, a young woman, maybe early 20s. Filthy, bruised, breathing shallow like her lungs weren't sure they wanted to keep going. Her wrists were tied with rough rope that had cut into her skin. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and across her back, just barely visible through her torn shirt, were deep, angry scars. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at him like someone who'd already lived through death, and she whispered, voice raw and broken, "You paid for me. Now finish it." Caleb didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't even flinch. He just stared. Because the truth is, some men fight wars and think they've seen hell. But hell isn't a battlefield. Hell is a human being dropped off at your door, carved up and left to rot, while somebody out there thinks they've done you a favor. He untied her wrists. The rope had dug so deep it had left wounds. He lifted her carefully, carried her inside, and set her down gently in the corner room. And for the first time in years, Caleb Thorne didn't know what to do next. But if you think this is just a story about a girl left at a stranger's doorstep, you haven't seen what she's carrying with her. Eliza didn't speak much the first few days. She slept like someone afraid to close their eyes too long. Caleb didn't push. He'd been around silence enough to know it had its own rhythm. Some men asked too many questions. He wasn't one of them. Instead, he kept her warm, left food where she could reach it, fresh water and a tin cup by the bed. Never once crossed the room unless she was asleep or clearly needed help. That kind of quiet takes patience, and maybe a little guilt, too. He'd seen those scars again when he changed her bandages, the way they curved down her back, deep and deliberate. It wasn't random. Somebody had taken their time with her, like they were trying to write something permanent, something cruel. Caleb didn't ask, but he saw the way her shoulders tensed every time she heard boots on wood. The way she flinched at sudden movements, the way she stared at the door like it might burst open at any moment. On the 3rd night, she sat up without his help, didn't say a word, just stared into the fire like she was waiting for it to talk back. Caleb sat nearby, sipping his coffee, giving her space. After a long while, she said it, soft and tired. "You didn't touch me." He looked up, just nodded. Most men would have. Caleb tossed another log into the fire. His voice was low, like he was talking to himself more than her. "I ain't most men." That was it. No long speeches, no soft music playing. Just that. Over the next week, she started helping around the place, brushed the horses, cleaned up dishes without being asked. One morning, Caleb caught her humming. Not a tune he recognized, but it was a sound. A real sound from someone who had been nothing but silent. And in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about feeding a wounded stranger. It was about watching a soul climb back up from the edge of a hole nobody saw but her. But if you think healing is a straight path, you better buckle up. Because what she's about to share is going to turn everything upside down. By the 2nd week, the silence broke. It wasn't over supper and it wasn't in daylight. It came late when the fire burned low and the coyotes had gone quiet. Eliza's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried like a bullet. She told Caleb what had happened. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to make his jaw tighten and his hands clench. She'd worked in the big house of a county official. Clean clothes, long hours, but decent enough at first. Then came the gambling, the debts piling up faster than he could pay. And when he couldn't cover what he owed, he used her like a poker chip, a bet he could afford to lose. One night she was hauled out of that house, tied up, dragged to a back room where the very men who should have been upholding the law took turns destroying her. That scar on her back, it wasn't random. It was a word carved with a knife while they held her down. Worthless. Caleb didn't answer. He just stared at the fire. But inside, something boiled. Something dark and old that he'd buried years ago. He'd fought in wars, seen men gutted and left in the dirt, but nothing stuck like this. This wasn't war, this was cowardice, and it was happening under the flag he'd once bled for. Eliza looked at him then, waiting for him to say something, anything, but he didn't speak. He only stood, walked outside into the cool night air, and when he came back minutes later, there was ink on his fingers and a letter on the table. A letter to an old army friend in Tucson, who now carried some weight in the garrison. Caleb didn't need guns or fists, not yet. He needed proof, and Eliza's scars were proof enough. For the first time since she'd arrived, she saw a flicker of hope, not a smile, not laughter, but the simple fact that someone believed her pain was worth writing down. That was a start. Now I know folks watching this might be thinking, where does it go from here? And if you're still with me, chances are you want to know just how far Caleb's quiet rage will take him and what that will mean for Eliza's fight to find herself again. That's the kind of story we tell here. And if you don't want to miss the rest, you might think about hitting that subscribe button. It keeps you at the fire with us. And believe me, the fire's about to get hotter. A week later, the desert gave them a visitor, not the kind that knocks polite on the door. This one rode in close to sundown, dust rising behind his horse, hat pulled low, the kind of man you know to keep your eyes on. Caleb spotted him from the porch, and before the man even dismounted, Caleb felt that old tension crawl back into his chest. Trouble had a way of showing itself without saying a word. The man called out like he owned the place, asking if the delivery had been received. He didn't use her name, didn't even call her a woman, just the delivery. That was enough to make Caleb's jaw tighten. He leaned on the post, kept his hand loose near his hip, but didn't draw. Not yet. The man stepped down, boots hitting dirt hard, and his eyes flicked toward the cabin window. Eliza was inside, watching through the cracks. Her breath came short. Her shoulders shook. Caleb offered him no welcome, just stood there in that quiet way he had, waiting for the stranger to make his move. And he did. The man said he was here to collect what wasn't his to begin with, said there'd been a mistake, said she needed to come back with him. He stepped toward the door. That was when Caleb moved. No shouting, no show, just a sharp step forward, his fist grabbing the man's collar, the other hand pressing cold steel under his chin. The fight didn't last long. It didn't need to. Caleb wasn't looking to kill, only to end it quick. Within moments, the man was on the floor of the cabin, wrists bound with rope, gags shoved in tight. Eliza didn't cheer, didn't smile. She just sat by the corner, watching in disbelief as someone finally stood between her and the men who'd treated her life like a coin to be tossed. Caleb dragged the stranger outside, tied him to the fence post, and waited for dawn. The desert has a way of punishing arrogance. Men come thinking they can take what they want, but out here, the land and the silence always collect their debt. He knew soldiers from Tucson would be passing through soon, and they'd get their proof. Flesh and blood this time, not just a letter. Now, if you think that one man tied to a post ends the story, you might want to hold tight. Because when power is challenged, it doesn't just sit quiet. It bites back. And that bite was already on its way. When dawn came, the soldiers from Tucson rode in, dust cloud trailing behind them. 6 men on horseback, rifles across their backs, the kind of authority that makes guilty men sweat. Caleb handed over the man bound to the post, along with the letter he'd written days before. They took him without question. The weight of his guilt was written all over his face, in his eyes, in the way he wouldn't look at Eliza standing in the doorway. She watched as the horseman disappeared into the horizon, the man who'd come to drag her back now being dragged away himself. And for the first time since she'd arrived in that wagon, wrapped in canvas and fear, she realized the fight was no longer hers alone to carry. Somebody had stood with her, and the world had finally listened. The days that followed were different. There was no more waiting for boots at the door, no more shadows on the porch that made her heart stop. She cooked, she worked the land, she even laughed once or twice, surprising herself as much as Caleb. He didn't say much, just went about his chores, fixed fences, tended the animals, but the silence between them was no longer heavy. It was a kind of peace, the kind you earn, not the kind you're given. One evening she sat by the fire, the same place she'd once whispered that broken plea. "You paid for me. Now finish it." But this time her voice was steady, strong. She told Caleb she wanted to stay, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because this was the first place that had ever given her a choice. Caleb didn't reply right away. He just nodded, slow, the kind of nod that meant more than a dozen words ever could. Out on that ranch, miles away from the noise of politics and greed, two people learned that healing doesn't always come in thunder or blood. Sometimes it comes quiet, in the sound of water boiling on the stove, in a scar that doesn't ache as much, in a man who chooses to listen instead of demand. Weeks turned into months. Eliza grew stronger, not just in body, but in spirit. She learned to ride, learned to shoot, learned that her past didn't define her future unless she let it. And Caleb, the man who'd opened that canvas and seen the worst humanity could offer, he learned something too, that sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought with guns. They're fought with kindness, with patience, with the simple act of seeing someone as human when the world has tried to make them less. One afternoon, as the sun set over the Arizona desert, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Eliza stood on the porch beside Caleb. They watched the horizon together, two people who'd found each other in the worst possible way and made something good from it. She turned to him, her voice soft but certain. "Thank you for not looking away." Caleb took a sip of his coffee, eyes still on the horizon. Wasn't nothing to look away from. Just a person needing help. Simple as that. But it wasn't simple. They both knew that. In a world where people turned blind eyes every single day, where cruelty was easier than courage, Caleb had chosen differently, and that choice had saved a life. Maybe that's what we forget too often, that sometimes the greatest strength is not in drawing a gun, but in choosing kindness when the world expects cruelty. That the scars we carry, no matter how deep, are not the end of our story. They're proof we kept walking, proof we survived, proof we're stronger than what tried to break us. Now let me ask you this. If you were in Caleb's boots, would you have opened that canvas? Would you have carried her inside, or would you have looked away like so many do? Because the truth is, every single day we face that choice. Maybe not with a wagon at our doorstep, but with people around us who are broken, hurting, carrying scars nobody sees. Do we turn away, or do we choose to see them? If this story moved you, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It keeps you right here with us, where stories of the Old West remind us not only of who we were, but who we can still choose to be. Because in the end, the West was never just about land and guns. It was about people, broken and brave, scarred and surviving, just like Eliza, just like all of us. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to stand when everyone else walks away. One person willing to say, "Not on my watch." One person who refuses to let evil win just because it's easier. Caleb Thorne was that person, and maybe, just maybe, you can be too.